this month's ACT-IAC Evolving the Workforce Community of Interest meeting. I'm Bob Clark. I am the communications chair. I'm the person who occasionally will fill up your inbox with emails from this group. But in my day job, I'm a manager at Monster Government Solutions. Welcome again. We've got a great presentation this month. And first, what we like to do is go around the room and have each person identify themselves, both with your name, your role, title, whatever, and the organization that you work for, just so our presenters have a sense of who they're going to be talking to this morning. We do have a number of folks who are on the line. This presentation this morning is going to be recorded, and we'll give you some more information about that. But first, let me just ask the young lady in the back to start and just introduce yourself, and then we'll just move around the room.
I'm Camille Tucker. I'm a program analyst with GSA's Employee Relocation Resource Center.
I'm Jeff Morris. I'm the Vice President of Global Business Development with GRC Global Mobility, based in Atlanta.
I'm Billy Scott. I'm with the Workplace Solutions Program at Customs and Border Protection. Chris Dye, Workplace Solutions, CBP.
Raymond Lamb, Workplace Solutions Program at CBP.
I'm Madeline Dunsmore. I'm with these guys too.
I work close to them. My name's Derek Langston for the Human Resources Department over at CBP.
Patty Kunkel, Manager of Operations for Lexicon Relocation.
Fadia Cat, Lexicon Relocation, Vice President of Client Services in the shopping region.
David Bronger, WHR Group, Relocation, Vice President for all the government and business development.
Lauren Turner, I'm the Director of Business Development for Whitebird Corporate Housing.
I'm Adam Davidson. I'm with Cyber Media Technologies, or CTech, the VP and General Manager for Human Capital and Training.
I'm Raju Budraju. I'm a Chief Architect with AT&T Communications.
I'm David Bushek, Client Solutions Executive, AT&T Solutions.
I'm Deborah Stuck. I'm with Monster Government Solutions. I'm a Strategic Account Manager.
Good morning. My name is John Travers. I'm with Capital Relocation. We manage multiple federal agencies for total relocation services based here in DC.
And hello to everyone on the line. For this month's meeting, we've asked each of you if you're in the sound of my voice, just so we can track attendance. We usually use the WebEx product, which we can see who's on the line, but for today we're not using that. Would you be kind enough to send an email to rwight@actiac.org. So you'll be sending an email to Rob Wright and just say in your title, I am on the EWF COI call. And that'll just allow us to know, do we need to have 5 lines, 10 lines, 20 lines, or whatever. It's our expectation that we've got about 20 people on the line, just so you'll have a sense of, and so you will all have a sense. And I am standing in for Deb Tomczyk, who is the chair of this community of interest. She, like many of us, is stuck in traffic, and she'll be in just a few moments. Also, Debbie Green, Debbie Brown is the programs chair, and she's not able to be here today. Also, Mika Cross. Mika Cross is with the Department of Labor. She is our government chair for the committee, and Deb Tomczyk is the industry chair. Just by way of background, because it's some of you, this is the first time I've had a chance to see you, this organization meets once a month. Yeah, let me do this for the benefits of those folks who are online. This organization meets once a month in meetings like this. Meetings are typically downtown, and they're always on the second Thursday of each month from 10 until 11:30. And we address topics related to human capital, and we solicit those topics. We have a government advisory panel of 6 to 8 chief human capital officers and CIOs that we get ideas and input from. We also solicit them from you in the room, and I'll be talking about upcoming events. For each of these events, I send out the handouts the day before, so for anyone who is registered, you would have gotten this electronically, but if you don't have them, there are 2 handouts for today. There is the general handout that covers who's speaking, the bios for each of the speakers, and this is a handout that CBP provided, and they'll probably be talking to it as the presentation goes on. So I'm going to put these over on the side, and so if you need these, feel free to come up and get them. And in a very timely manner, Deb Tomczyk has just arrived, so I'm going to hand the reins over to Deb, and she has a couple of things she wants to cover, and then I'll talk about programs.
I think he's extremely generous to say that I'm timely. I think I'm definitely not timely.
This is how folks on
So sorry. Traffic was a little more challenging today than normal, so I apologize to all of you. There were just 2 things I wanted to mention. First, I'd like to welcome you. I'm sure, Bob, you already did that. But my name's Deb Tomczyk, and I'm the industry chair for this subcommittee. I would like to mention 2 things. We're getting ready to launch a major initiative for cyber workforce. We're looking for examples of cyber workforce initiatives in the government that if you are interested in participating, that you would reach out to us. And then secondly, we are doing an HR data analytics project that's coming into completion, and we're going to be sharing that information in the next couple months. So I just wanted to mention both of those things to you. And I want to turn it over to Tim.
Oh, thank you. You have a couple more logistical things I
Yes,
think
now
to
let me
mention.
just give you a couple of program updates. Next month's meeting, the April meeting, will be focusing on succession planning in the federal government. And we actually did a in-depth study on this about 5 years ago. We're revisiting that topic, and we are looking for panelists for that event. So if anyone knows any agencies that are doing particularly well with succession planning, and either you know agencies or you know specific people working in that area, please send an email to brownde3@yahoo.com. That's Debbie Brown, and Debbie is our programs chair, and again, that's brownde3@yahoo.com to help us find the best speakers for that session. That's the April session. The May session is on a very interesting area. It's on what makes a success in hiring people into government from industry. And what we're talking about there is for the regulating industry, for the regulating agencies such as SEC, FDA, others who are regulating parts of industry, but then the best people to hire in sometimes are people from that industry. Also DoD, hiring in from government contractors. What's the best way in your selection process, in your onboarding process? What's the best way to make that work? It's a little different than just hiring in other people from within government. It's even different from just hiring across the American populace. What we're really focusing on is what makes it work when you're hiring somebody that's been on the other side of the table from you and now they're coming in. So again, we're looking for panelists for that event. If you have any suggestions we pretty much figured out which agencies do this, and we're looking around in those agencies. But if you know people who are specifically working in that area or might have something to say, please send a note to brownde3@yahoo.com and suggest, and we'll take it from there. Let me mention a couple of administrative issues related to today. This session is And I apologize for reading this, but it's legalistic, so I need to read it. This session is off the record, which means no one, press, industry, or agency should be posting quotes or summaries, including internal or external social media sites, without going through proper agency protocols. Also, the policy for this meeting is no solicitation. Please don't make sales calls and exchange cards here. Do feel free to follow up with anyone after the meeting, but don't attack the speakers after the meeting. Let's see. I mentioned that we have flyers here with both the bios of the speakers as well as the document that CBP distributed. They're available here. And before we start, please, both in the room, put your cell phone on mute, and on the phone, please put your phone on mute so as not to disrupt the speakers in the room. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you to all of our speakers. First, let me introduce Terry Schaefer, who is our moderator and our host. I think it's particularly appropriate that we're talking about relocation topics today and mobility. And this meeting, in some sense, is relocated because we typically have these meetings at 1725 I Street, but Terry has been kind enough to have it hosted here, which is always better to do that. Terry has both expertise within government on employee relocation and mobility topics, but she also, and maybe we should have you as a panelist in that May event, she came from industry. So she has the industry perspective as well as now the government perspective, and she's uniquely qualified to lead this event, and so I turn it over to Terry.
Okay, thank you everyone. And thanks for being here. We've had a little logistical mess this morning with us having our fire alarm go off. We're all outside wondering if we're gonna get back in. So I'm glad we're actually in here and settling down to our program. I'm a program analyst here at GSA. I'm in the Employee Relocation Resource Center. And my role is to actually work with federal agencies, consulting with them on how they've developed their relocation programs, providing them with data so they have benchmarking, so they can understand best practices, and so that they can ensure that their programs are running efficiently and effectively, cost effectively. And so we work with the agencies. We have a broad community of relocation folks within the agencies as well as the suppliers. So it's a lot of information gathering and sharing and knowledge transfer. So I'm particularly excited to be here today with the folks on the panel because we are actually getting an opportunity to hear from the HR side of this. So we're getting to hear from HR leaders who, in the government, who incorporate relocation as well as virtual and telework into their workforce mobility program. And so I'm not gonna just tie up the time here talking about myself and introducing us. I think you guys really wanna be hearing from them today. So I'm gonna let you guys give a little introduction. We have quite a few folks on the phone here, so I think the main thing is we just have to be speaking into our phones and we should be good. Sure.
My name is Julie Helferty, and I'm a unit chief of the transfer unit for the FBI, which it handles essentially all the employee transfers for the FBI, as well as transfer policy. And we also do field, so my unit also handles field staffing, lateral movement of agents, analysts, professional staff employees, everything other than promotional piece of selecting and moving people around the country, as well as overseas. And then we also manage the relocation vendors and our relocation budget as well. So that's essentially all my area. This all sits within the Human Resources Division, Employee Selection and Development Program section of the FBI.
My name is Trent Frazier. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I'm the Director of Workplace Solutions. We are the primary internal organization right now focused on workforce mobility across our agency, extending as far out as what you would consider a remote or fully distributed workforce. And that's kind of where we're evolving towards as an organization.
I'm Dan Scott. I'm the Deputy Chief Human Capital Officer for the Intelligence Community at the Office of Director of National Intelligence. We have a little bit different problem in that telework does not usually work for handling classified information, so we manage mobility in a very different way.
Hi, I'm Chip Black from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We're the regulator of national banks, so those of you that may bank with Bank of America, BB&T, those types, we charter and regulate those entities. Workforce relocation is very critical for us because we have such a mobile workforce. It's really the way to get promoted in the agency, to move up. And the agency really values those cross-cutting skills and getting people to move to different geolocated areas. So it's really a critical program for us. We look forward to sharing what we do.
So we're going to start out by talking about relocation. And just to give a little bit of background, in the federal government, a Title V agency that's Title V bound, like Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice, have to follow the federal travel regulations. And those regulations define what entitlements or benefits you give to the employee to get them from point A to point B. So it's, home finding, travel expenses, disposing of the prior home, securing a new residence, temporary housing, moving the household goods. So those are all the things in the FTR that are defined at a minimum and at a maximum level. So then the agency develops a policy or program that meets their mission needs and provides them with the level of those benefits. So there's some flexibility, but it's within a framework. Those that are Title V exempt, the two folks here as well, have a little bit more flexibility in developing their program, but tend to align with the FTR. So as far as you've developed your policy, how do you go, and I'll just kind of let you guys go down the table if you want, how do you all incorporate that into your talent management program, and how do you use that to recruit and retain employees?
For employees, and it depends, and we do a couple different things. For every promotional move internally, we offer full cost moves, and then externally, if we're new hires to the agency, they're entitled to, and this is according to the federal travel regulations, what we call limited cost moves. So new hires to the agency are entitled to shipment of household goods and en route travel. And we basically incorporate this to all employees that are, with the exception of, I'd say, all agent promotional moves and the professional staff promotional moves that are in key positions like running a field office or a financial manager or an intelligence analyst. All those are entitled to full cost moves as well. So we essentially provide them with all the benefits that are entitled by federal travel regulations to all those categories of employees. Now, when we have a category of employee that's promotional and can be identified locally, then we obviously, due to budget constraints, will look to provide a local move, or what's a no-cost move for a local hire. One thing that we've recently, a policy that we've recently incorporated, and it's really a pilot that we're doing in conjunction with ATF and the DOJ, is what we call the Voluntary Relocation Pilot Program. We call the VRPP, and that's essentially giving employees the option to take a lump sum amount versus individual vouchering of the initial parts of the move, which is the house hunting, temporary quarters, the en route travel, miscellaneous vouchers, which are the first part of the move, and it's the first full vouchers, and so it's essentially more beneficial to the employees because it essentially puts a lump sum amount, which we looked at average vouchers over many years and determined what those lump sum amounts would average out to be, and then we give those to the employees, and then they're taxed as well, but essentially the employee is given, if it's a family moving, essentially about $10,000 or $11,000 in their pocket to do what they want as far as getting themselves temporary quarters, the en route travel, the move to the location. So it gives a lot of flexibility to the employee to manage their move, in essence. So that is, and I think, an added incentive that we've given to people because, with the house, in the past with the housing market, some employees were at a loss with their moves. So this was sort of an option to help people balance out the cost of moving. And it just, We started it last year and then suspended it briefly while GSA took a look at it. And then we just finally got GSA approval. We're just launching it again as of March 1st, the RPP. We did it for a month in 2014, and so we were tracking the average on this policy, the average rate of acceptance to see where our break-even points would be. And it was overwhelmingly requested by employees, and we exceeded 75% of the people that were transferring at that time opted into the program, which is a cost savings ultimately to us, and it was basically very beneficial for the employees as well too.
So let me preface my comments by saying I tend to focus more on the workforce mobility side than the relocation side, but so just take that. And second, thanks to John for being willing to come close to the table, and to the rest of you for leaving John by himself.
Set a bar.
Yeah, you gotta be the leader. For CBP in particular, and I think more broadly for DHS, relocation kind of operates in two spheres for us. One is we are a primary line organization, so we have a border. CBP has a border, literally it's the national borders, that we have to operate at. Relocation then is a tool for us to respond to changing conditions at that front line. Oftentimes for us that might mean relocating a number of agents or officers or support personnel to various areas along the border, depending on conditions in that region, whether we have a growth in transnational criminal organization movement across the border, or immigrant patterns across the border, contraband across the border. So relocation for us is constantly an active tool for us to manage the distribution of our workforce along that national perimeter. We have a somewhat unique, although not entirely unique, condition in that in several instances where we're relocating folks, there is no housing economy for them to enter, right? I mean, we operate in very remote areas, so in many cases we become the landlord to our employees, and when we're relocating them, we're also providing what you would think of as the community amenities that otherwise would be provided by a local township or city. We're also providing those amenities pretty uniformly across for the employee in those environments. So in that instance, relocation for us adds some challenges because we have to find ways to create incentives for someone to work in an environment that is frankly very remote and imposes some additional hardship challenges for them and for their families. In some cases, we've even had to explore instances where we're relocating the employee but allowing the family to remain in another community for some period of time so that they can continue to conduct operations. We even have, for example, forward operating bases. So we'll do temporary relocations to a forward operating base in an environment where frankly there is literally no infrastructure. And we provide the infrastructure for that employee, but then we also ensure that their families are staying in a community where they get what you would think of as conventional amenities in that environment. So in the operational sphere for us, our relocation programs in every way service our frontline mission, right? Because they're essentially allowing us to constantly shift our workforce to match the requirements for our operations along the border or at a port of entry. In a second sphere, we have to use relocation as a tool for succession management because, especially at the border, let's say, for example, you're opening a new port of entry. We're actually opening one in Detroit, theoretically in the next couple of years, depending on budgets. You can't staff that port of entry with new officers, right? Because for what we're asking them to do, they have to have a certain degree of experience to be successful in their mission. So you might be pulling officers in from FLETC, from your training programs, and preparing them to deploy, but they cannot deploy you couldn't staff an entirely new port of entry with nothing but new officers. So then you're using your relocation program as a tool to prepare a new operation to come online, whether that's at an airport, whether that's at a seaport, a land port, or now for us over the last 10 years or so, we're deploying overseas. So we staff personnel into pre-clearance sites in 77 countries around the world. You can't send brand new officers to another country to conduct operations, so now you're using relocation programs for those operations to stand up, and then backfilling with new personnel at locations where they can gain the experience that they need to perform their mission. A third area then that we focus our relocation programs around is more of what you would think of as conventional talent management, which is for folks to progress through their career path, they have to move through various operational areas or mission support areas within the agency. Relocation then becomes a tool for them to gain those kinds of experiences as they're moving up that career progression.
Detroit, I want to go there. I'm ready.
It's a $3.8 billion bridge. It's going to be great.
Well, I'm Dan Scott with the Intelligence Committee, and like everyone else, we move people around. I think I would say up front that there's a difference in the relocation policies for new hires versus existing workforce. So the new hires will generally tend to hire young and tell them to pack their car and drive to Washington, D.C. Right? So we won't offer a large relocation bonus for new hires. But for the existing workforce, since the Intelligence Committee is spread across 6 departments, in general, they follow the federal travel regulation on that. And for those of us who are not under those departments, we also follow the FTR and use those relocation incentives to get people abroad, overseas, at other locations that we need to have them in. Just a couple points. First, we greatly appreciate OMB and OPM removing the limits on the 3 Rs from the 2010. That was a huge issue for us. We have difficulties getting people, we need a lot of people, getting people to go to Hawaii because of the cost of living. And we've had a recent adjustment there. We have a great number of vacancies in Hawaii, and because we're looking to send higher level people. And so there's a concern about how that housing market and that wage market is calculated across the government. When you're looking at the Hawaii labor force versus what you need to pay your workforce, the figures just don't match. So there are a couple other areas where that's true. San Francisco, Miami to some extent. But Hawaii is where we're really hurting, and that's why that release of the 2010 limits on 3 Rs is so important. Sequestration hurt, and it hurt bad. There should be no one who believes that sequestration was a good thing. It really limited our ability to do things. So we don't want to repeat that. And finally, the other point I would make, we do have a lot of people go abroad, spend time in embassies. Housing is expensive. There seems to be a surcharge from the state on housing. So every time you do that, but we do, like the CBP and others, we don't want to leave people overseas for 15 years in the same job. You want to rotate people every 2-3 years. Keep fresh and for a variety of other reasons. So we do pay the bill. You've got to pay the bill to get people to do it. You cannot expect people to move on their own dime.
Thanks. Like I said, relocation at the OCC is really very mission critical. As was said earlier, the OCC is an accepted service organization, so we don't exactly follow Title V, which gives us some flexibilities there. Our controller is responsible for setting pay and benefits for all OCC employees. And some of the things I'm going to talk to you about are really designed to entice people to get to move around to certain high demand areas and high skill areas. New York, for example, we have a rent and mortgage subsidy program that we offer to people to get them, to entice them to move to New York, because it's a very expensive area, very hard to get people to move there, those type of places. Thankfully, sequestration really was never an issue for the OCC. We're funded by fees that banks pay us to be regulated, so we're exempt from that. But we do offer a full range of house buyouts, travel expenses, moving expenses, all those type of things, and those are available to all OCC employees. So really, the focus is to try to get people, especially high-value skills, to move across the country. We're all over the United States. We have about 150 locations. So we, there's a high chance that we've visited pretty much every town, every little town in the country that has a national bank. Every community that has a national bank, we're in there at least once every 18 months. So, very highly mobile workforce, and a workforce that does a lot of travel too. So we have some incentives where if people spend a certain number of nights, it's called a nights out program. So if they spend a certain number of nights out in the field in the travel status, I think it's 50 nights, they get a certain extra supplement to their salary to incent that travel. We also have what's called the in lieu of program. And that's where if we have an employee who is very highly mobile, so we have these things called lead experts. So if you're a lead expert in, say, bank information technology, and you really have to go all over the country and visit, very different national banks, we may give you a supplement to your salary instead of moving you to a new location. That works out especially if we have a location like New York, that employee may want to stay in Peoria or something where it's more advantageous for them to travel or to live. We also have an alt location program, very similar to the in lieu of program, but that's basically instead of moving the employee or having the employee, that work then comes to them. So they stay in Kansas or wherever they are. And then that work actually comes to them. We also have a very robust rotational program, so that's where we send our bank examiners out on a 2 to 3 year rotation. We pay them long-term travel for those instances, and they stay in that job for 2 to 3 years, and then they rotate back to their full-time job. Those are pretty much the big ones. We also do offer telework, although, in an agency as highly mobile as ours, telework's kind of a difficult thing because we need to be in the banks all the time. We don't exactly, we're not a huge user of telework, but, that's something that we're constantly exploring and constantly trying to weigh the costs and benefits to that. So, you have to take into your questions.
Yeah, I have another one. And you mentioned sequestration, you mentioned the budget and those issues, and I was with a law enforcement agency before coming to GSA, and that's what was happening then, and it was a painful process, kind of finding places where you could pull back and where you could cut without hurting the organization. So how has sequestration or just ongoing budgetary pressure, and how has that affected your ability to move people and to incorporate this into your program?
From sequestration, I think to echo what you said, was pretty dramatic for us. And so essentially it had made us step back and look at all our way of doing business and how we managed our transfer budget, and then what transfers we deemed to be most critical to meet the most critical staffing needs. So we have, a couple different areas, which are the promotional transfers, which are for the workforce development to bring people back to headquarters and back out to our field offices. We have the overseas transfers and we have the executive transfers, and so those are sort of like what we considered mandatory transfers that we had to find and we had to do. Then the next line of transfers were to fill staffing needs were out in the field offices, whether it was a small, what we call resident agency, which is a small little location, and to meet those staffing needs versus meeting the staffing needs of the field office. So we move agents around on lateral transfers to fill general staffing needs. So those became second-tier priorities. So if we didn't have, so we would manage our budget as like, okay, we're going to meet the critical needs first. The second tier will have to wait. We'll have to hold off. And then, so that was sort of how we responded to sequestration. We've been working in a much limited budget, transfer budget, ever since sequestration, and manage it very closely. And then we always are looking at different ways that we can reduce the cost. One other way that we looked at reducing the cost was providing mobility to our workforce and to meet the needs of the workforce by developing policies that helped employees for moves that employees would take previously through a cost method, like a hardship transfer move. We reevaluated those moves and we offer expanded policies, such as we have a parental medical policy. So if somebody needs to move to a certain location to deal with aging parents, ill parents, if they need to move because their spouse is part of another federal agency or military, we allow moves along with those spouses, but those are all self-paid moves. So what we did was we expanded policies to allow more self-paid moves so that the employees would move themselves, meeting their needs, and then occasionally that meets our staffing needs, and those are moderate, non-promotional. So we expanded that way, that sort of mobility in our workforce to meet the needs. So it's a win-win for the employee, and then it also meets our staffing needs as well. And I think you mentioned Honolulu and San Francisco. Those are some of our challenges too. So we struggle with staffing. The employees in Honolulu, San Francisco, Anchorage, and San Juan. We struggle with the cost of living, what's going on there. And we also have a workforce that struggles with really remote areas as well too. So we have policies that to encourage people to go to those locations, we offer what we call exit benefits, which means if you serve 3 years to 5 years in a certain location, we'll offer another transfer, cost transfer back out to any office that you desire, as long as there's availability there. So we offer that for San Juan, we offer that for the southwest border. We have some really remote Indian country locations that they're challenging for the remoteness and challenging because the nature of the work is very difficult. It's homicides, that's all they do. Homicides, serious child sexual assault cases that are difficult for the employees, so they can really only stay there for several years in that nature of work. So that we then offer a way out after 3 years to transfer to another location. So that's some of the way we encourage the staffing and offer benefits to staffing. For San Juan and Anchorage, we are looking at exploring retention incentives and exit benefits out as well too. So we'll offer it 6 years for Honolulu and Anchorage. At 6 years, the employees are eligible if they get on the list and they have a high enough EOD, eligible for a transfer out. But then we also offer some retention incentives because they experience costs to travel back to the homeland. So they get a yearly retention incentive too. The same with Saipan and Guam as well. So those are some of the different ways we balance all that. Oh, did you open some stuff? Yeah, and it's challenging. It's very
26 hours to get there. Yeah. So first let me say that I would echo most of what you said, because most of the challenges you just outlined, we face similar challenges and we're taking similar steps. Sequestration is a little bit unique for us because really going back as far as 2008, there was a massive ramp up in the number of agents that Congress was asking us to hire and deploy, and in fact we're probably one of the few law enforcement agencies that actually has a hiring floor instead of a hiring ceiling, because we are required to keep a certain number of agents and officers on the front line. So that happened in 2008, and roughly in 2011 you started to see, 2010, 2011 you started to see sequestration happening. So the impact was a little bit dualistic for us because we were being given a lot of resources to keep hiring and deploying agents and officers, but then sequestration was impacting the other parts of our budget that in some ways relate to our ability to deploy agents and officers and also hire mission support and do some of the other kinds of talent management that you would think of. So the impact for us was a little bit mixed because we kept hiring and deploying and moving and relocating agents and officers along the front line, but then for the other aspects that I mentioned earlier, like rotational assignments where people are moving up the leadership chain or gaining other kinds of experience, some of that suffered as part of that process for us, and that continues. Every year we continue in our budget to get a specific set of mandates that say you have to get this number of agents and officers hired, trained, and deployed, and down to the level of location. So we'll even sometimes be told at this specific location you need to have this number of officers and agents hired, trained, and deployed, which oftentimes for us actually ends up meaning you have to relocate experienced officers from another location to that location and then hire, train, and deploy to the one to backfill where you're pulling resources from to prepare that. So For us, it can get very statutorily, I'm going to say convoluted, off the record, convoluted, because at the same time, you know, we have a lot of mandates driving us in specific directions to hire, train, and deploy, or by default, relocate. We are also then subject to the same strictures in other areas that sequestration imposes.
For the Intel community, as everybody else, there's always trade-offs in budget, right? There's always limits. You never have enough money. The difference with sequestration was the mechanics of how it had to be implemented. Every program line had to take the cut. You couldn't move money from one account to the other. So that's what resulted in this under the law. So people just stopped hiring, you stopped training, you stopped conferences. You couldn't PCS as many people as you hoped because you took a big hit in that. The DoD furloughed people. They started for 11, I think they ended at 7 days. But that was tremendously divisive of who got furloughed, who didn't. And those are the kind of things that hurt us with the sequestration.
Yeah, sequestration is a non-appropriation issue. Didn't really impact us that much from a budgetary perspective because we're completely divorced from Congress from a budget perspective. But that's not to say that you know, budget pressures aren't always present. I mean, as we're sort of a steward of the banks that fund us, we're a steward of their funds, so they you know, aren't exactly excited to be wasting their money. They want us to be as you know, keepers of their money as we can be. So we're constantly doing cost-benefit analysis to make sure that some of the programs, some of the benefits that we offer are meeting their intended results. So for example, the In Lieu Of program, we're doing a cost-benefit analysis right now to see if that stipend that we're giving those employees, if that's actually resulting in a net benefit to the agency. We want them to be in the lower cost area. We give them this pay stipend, and then, you know, we have to factor in how much travel costs and other expenses they've incurred. So, you know, we're constantly trying to get to that cost benefit to be a good steward of the bank's funds.
So, kind of leading into it, I have one other question relative to relocation, and then I want to make sure we give virtual and telework the time and attention it needs. So, yes. And then we will open it up to questions at the end. So like the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll have some time for questions in the room. So, so as far as relocation goes, you know, we've seen it, the optics around it are that it's very expensive. And how could an employee be getting that much when you start looking at what the price tag is? So what we've seen happen is some agencies will say, well, then I'm not going to move people if it's too expensive, or give them the bare minimum. But then there are all these consequences to HR, you know, then you don't have the tool that you need to get people. You have employees who aren't productive, you have, you know, downtime, employee engagement is a huge topic, and you've got employees who are really unhappy, or thinking about leaving, or, you know, gonna have left the organization. So how do you deal with quantifying the return on investment? It's a tough thing to do. How do you approach that so you can make the case as to why we're going to spend more money if we do it this way as opposed to this way? That's a hard question. It is a very hard question. Yeah, turn on investment. Do you want to start at the other end?
Yeah, let's start with the controller.
Yeah, he's in the money field.
No, I'll just give a PR plug here. We're always in the top of the best places to work.
I wonder why.
Especially for pay.
Congress doesn't do anything to us.
No, it's the OCC is a great place, and you know there's always this want at the OCC to be on the cutting edge, to be, you know, out in front of things. So we're constantly looking for new programs, how we can improve programs. You know, and that's really exciting. But yeah, I mean, it's a constant struggle, you know, because even though, you know, if you compare some of our salaries to maybe some of the other government salaries, yeah, they may be higher, but the type of talent that we want, you know, we're looking at compliance managers for major banks. You know, those are the type of people that we want to come to the OCC. And if you compare our salaries to what those folks are making in the market, not exactly the best, you know. So we have to get kind of inventive with some of these other programs, especially to get people to move to high demand areas like New York, San Francisco, Boston, very high cost areas, very high demand areas for these types of talents that we're looking for.
For the intelligence community, I think, you know, we don't have a great deal of attrition. And so the return on investment question is difficult because all the normal factors, are people quitting, you know, are they retiring early, and all those kind of things don't really happen. So there's always the budget guy who thinks, well, you can not pay those things and you can not give relocation bonuses because people are going to do it anyways because they love the mission. And the trouble with that is, you know, there's a difference what you can do with a 23-year-old, you tell them pack your car and move to Washington, and what you can do with a 35-year-old with kids at school. And you might get away with that once, but if you continually ask people to pay out of pocket because, you know, you need to enhance your career by moving, but it's good for you, so therefore you pay for it, the cost of that is long-term. And so we always are in that effort about, you know, I understand the mission's important, but you do have to take care of the people. So we generally want to make sure that managers or budget folks don't, you know, kind of say, well, we're not going to offer command-sponsored or family-sponsored tours overseas anymore. You're just going to leave your family behind because when you're gone 50% of the time of your career, that just isn't going to work. So.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a really complicated question, which is why I think you punted. Smart. You're like, wait, this is complicated. You know, I mean, because realistically, the cost of benefit on this issue is complicated for a number of factors. So for us, and probably similar to the intelligence community, you know, you can hire somebody out of the Border Patrol, you know, and send them to the Border Patrol Academy, to FLETC, train them, and if they're young, you can excite them with the idea of doing their mission, and that might last, you know, until they're 25. And then you say, hey, I need to send you to Pegan, North Dakota. Anyone know where Pegan, North Dakota is? Raise your hand. It's a great tourist spot. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. And they say, oh, that's fascinating because my wife or my husband really likes where we are now and would be perfectly willing for me to not be promoted in exchange for staying where we are. So for us, the cost of benefit is for us to do our mission, we have to find ways to incentivize some of the movement that has to happen to support operations along the border. And then when you add to that now our extension of our operational footprint overseas, you're thinking even further down the road of incentivizing that. And we have similar problems where, you know, if we're asking somebody to relocate overseas, are they taking their family? If they have kids, are we, you know, connecting them with the State Department to use embassy resources for schooling, healthcare, or are we now providing those resources through in-country support? There's a whole litany of challenges associated with that, and depending on, you know, I was involved with deploying attachés to London, FYI. That's amazing, it wasn't hard to attract somebody to London. But then when we start sending the attachés to countries maybe not as enticing as London, you start getting into those questions writ large all over again. So for us, we have to prioritize resources around that mission requirement. And the downstream impact is for things that aren't directly frontline mission capabilities, we may not have the resources to do the same kinds of services and support any longer. And, you know, to make that subtle transition towards the talk about mobility, one of the things we're starting to ask is, do we need to move you for you to be successful in the job that you perform, right? Because one of the logical questions, especially the more you start talking about knowledge workers, is, do we need you, you know, I think you've mentioned a couple times, pack your car and move to Washington, D.C. I mean, honestly, how many of you guys own homes in Washington, D.C. right now? I do, and I'm excited every day to pay that mortgage. Right? Literally every day someone's like, aren't you excited to be in the federal government? I'm like, yeah, public service, hooray. And the question you start to ask the question, if in an environment where we can connect people virtually and begin to connect people through technology, and where we can begin to chase labor markets that exist outside of Washington, D.C. If you're looking for somebody in technology, guess what? They're not in Washington, D.C. They're being trained in schools in other parts of the country. And they can be enticed to stay in those areas because guess who's hiring in those areas? Technology companies who grounded themselves around those schools and programs. So for us, the question starts to be, wait a minute, maybe relocation isn't always the de facto solution for that category, that role, that job. We began to explore other ways to connect work to the person. I think you mentioned that earlier. We're now moving down that road because I think this is sort of a Gladwellian tipping point, right? This is one of your moments where technology has caught up enough that now we can begin to explore a broader concept of the workforce that doesn't always require us to position people in Washington, D.C. Can't hide anymore.
I know. So I think similar to what the OD&I experience, it's like you can't, there's always a tipping point, on it. And we're sort of keeping the balance as far as, paying for everything versus letting it be on the employee to pay for it and retention. So the FBI has very high retention rates too. We don't have people quitting and resigning, although people threaten it sometimes when they're unhappy, but our attrition rate is very low. But I hear in my unit all the complaints when people lose money on moves, or it's too expensive for them to move, or they're living in places that's too expensive and they can't get out, they need to get out. I mean, there's that angst exists in the workforce, but whether or not that forces people to quit is another thing. But I can say that in our most recent memory, as far as meeting staffing needs and mobility, is following when our C-team counterterrorism mission expanded greatly here at headquarters, and we needed to increase staffing here in Washington, D.C. All our positions were paid moves here to D.C., but the cost of living here was great, so great that, and you were talking about people midstream in their career, moving their families, moving their kids, making that decision to leave a much more affordable lifestyle to come to D.C. For a one promotion pay grade, and then the question mark of where they would go next. All that uncertainty, we couldn't meet our staffing needs that were required. That basically Congress placed on us. So in lieu of transferring people here, we began what we call a TDY program. So we TDY people here for what's essentially the same amount of time that they would do if they came moved here permanently to staff headquarters in a supervisory capacity before going back out in the field. And so we bring people to headquarters on an 18-month TDY. And essentially, it's at a reduced TDY rate, so they get about 50% of the TDY benefits. And then we do the cost comparison, that essentially what we found is that costs less overall than moving somebody in and moving somebody out. And it's much more beneficial for the employees because they can bring their family, they don't have to bring their family, they can leave their family behind. Or they pack the family and bring them here, but then they can always have the option to go back home. So one thing that we, to address the uncertainty for employees too, is that we always give them the option to go back to their original field office after they come here to DC. Even if they've been assigned permanently, if they stay here 1 year, they can pack up their own bags and pay for their own move back home if they want. So it gives people that lifeline back to where they started, which is, a lot of the uncertainty and attracting people to move to DC is, the change in where they'll go after. So that's one way that we've managed that as far as quantifying whether or not it's worth the expense and meeting the staffing needs as well too.
Terry, if I could just follow up on Julie, because it's a very specific example, and I don't know if you're aware of the issue we had with OD&I with that policy. So there's a substantial number of FBI support to the National Counterterrorism Center, and the 18 months wasn't sufficient to build that expertise that we needed. So it was a big debate about it, but it's a good example when you talk about, one, I think we ended up paying the PCS costs, and you guys paid the relocation bonus. I think this is the way they did it.
This is for the IAs?
Right, it's for the intelligence analysts, right?
Yeah,
So we ended up paying the PCS costs because the 18 months wasn't good enough. But it's a good example of how, you know, we really need to think about how to do work differently. In this case, it's classified work, but at the field activity offices, you can have classified systems. So this is an example where we were struggling to get expertise in from across the FBI, and it may make better sense in the future to connect virtually, right? And that's what we're trying to work on with our information technology enterprise. So I don't have to pay PCS costs or move someone, pay them a relocation bonus. I may be able to have them, you know, put a different sign on their computer, say today I'm working for OD&I, and they can still stay in Atlanta or, you know, Albuquerque or wherever they need to be.
Actually, I handled that staffing. It was challenging.
It was very challenging.
And it was the first time, and I can't remember, did we bring the COI or not?
Yeah,
Or
you
we-
used to, but it just didn't work for us, right?
Yeah, because.
So, but it's taking 3 years to do the PCS process to fill those positions.
Yeah.
So it's very, very expensive, and then the concern, of course, is after their tour at OD&I, they're in Washington DC, now what do you do with them? Do you PCS, does FBI pay to PCS them back?
Yeah, and so that's, we're always strategizing on the exit strategy for employees in this situation. So we're always,
Right.
it's like you have to sort of lay out where will you go after. So, because these tours are short. So you have to say, at the end of this, are we going to place you mandatorily, you're going to stay in DC into some other unknown position? Do you have an option? So we try to, in those postings, give people a couple different options so they don't feel like they're stuck, like they're locked in,
Right.
which is what people are afraid of, you know, if it doesn't work out for them. And then to echo what you said, we are in some of our support functions for the FBI looking at outsourcing, and we already have outsourced, or basically housing the personnel in Pocatello, West Virginia, Huntsville, different, you know, support functions for the FBI where the technology is, where the employees are. And it's less expensive for the agency, and it's less expensive for moving people. So.
Well, that leads us perfectly into the virtual and telework, and I will have to let you go first. Okay,
Yay.
itching to talk about this.
Let me tell you what we do. We're better than OCC. Probably not, because they're amazing. Oh my god.
It's hard to beat.
Yeah, right. OCC gives you a shoulder rub. Here. You don't do that. Okay. So first let me start, and I know it was in the title. Let me start. I really appreciate it and love it if all of you would stop using the word telework. It's one of those words that it served a purpose for a generation and needs to die. Okay? Because when you're talking about workforce mobility now, what you really need to do is think of workforce mobility as a spectrum, right? Beyond just the on-site or at-home site arrangement, right? So telework is an instance of workforce mobility, but it is not workforce mobility, okay? And all the things you've started to hear us alluding to in the conversation so far about having a workforce that might be in, West Virginia or Atlanta, or working from their home office, but their assigned office in Atlanta, but assigned to an organization here in Washington, D.C., those are also instances of workforce mobility, because really all what you're talking about doing is untethering the employee from place, right? And starting to think about work as the thing that the employee is providing to the organization, not the place that they're going to be housed. And if you can untether the employee from the idea of place, the options for you to think about how to place and organize your workforce just grow, in infinitum. And that's what we're starting to work towards now. So we still employ telework as a tool. Telework is certainly a viable tool, but it's not the only tool that we're starting to consider. We're considering ideas like remote work, which is, hey, I'm the employee who's off-site out of a dedicated government building 5 days a week doing largely transactional work through a virtual connection to the office. But I'm providing that same service to the agency. I can be in Charlotte, I can be in Boston, I can be in Montana, I can be anywhere there's an internet connection, right? And if you look at the private sector, many of you and many of your colleagues have already mastered that concept, right? We're now embarking down that same road because of the same constraints and challenges that the private sector have already realized, we as the government are beginning to realize. And when you look at that from a retention perspective, a lot of the incoming workforce How many of you guys have seen the movie Office Space? Right? That is the concept of government work that exists in the incoming workforce. And our job is frankly to eviscerate that concept. To say to the incoming workforce, we are not asking you to sit in a cubicle, to work at a dumb terminal all day, to answer a phone, to have a guy with a cup of coffee standing over you. That is not work for us anymore. What we're asking for you to do now is provide the deliverables, services, products, transactions, whatever it is that your role is in our agency through all of the capabilities, tools, technologies, practices, and policies that we're going to provide you as the employee. And if you start to think down that perspective, mobility then gives you a spectrum of capabilities. Now the challenge is law, regulation, and policy have to catch up to that, right? So if I ask an employee today to telework, they have to sign an agreement. That agreement says, I will telework Tuesday and Thursday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., right? What if I need you on site on a Tuesday? Sorry, my telework agreement says Tuesday and Thursday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., and that's abject foolishness, right? Because for us, I was mentioning coming in, I had my staff meeting at Juan Valdez Coffee Shop across the street before coming in here this morning. Why? Because that was conducive to what we needed to do for the morning. Some of my employees are going to leave from this discussion and go to buildings out in Northern Virginia and do their job for the rest of the day. Some will go off-site, and some will go back to our office site. And that's great. Some will work till 6 p.m., some will probably work till 8 p.m., and that's great, right? Because what I care about is, are they delivering, so I know all of them are like 8 p.m., I don't think so. Ray will. You know, what matters to me is, you have a deliverable, you have a service, you have a product, you have a transaction that you provide to the government. You're accomplishing it in the time and to the expectations that we as the government have articulated for you. You've done your job. You have accomplished work, right? And that's what we're working towards when we think about workforce mobility now.
Yeah, it's Dan Scott. I love that Juan Valdez Coffee Shop, by the way. So that's a good place for staff meeting, but we're not going to be able to go there for our staff meeting.
No skiff at the
No skiff in Juan Valdez.
I haven't get my first gift, don't worry.
So if you get one in, I'll do it. But, so our challenge is precisely that. It's the classified work for the most part. Some people can telework or whatever, a little easier, but the mission cannot. So our challenge then is, how do you connect people? So we have several initiatives. One is a rotational program we call the Joint Duty Program, where we'll take an analyst from CIA and they'll go up to NSA for a 2 or 3 year assignment. It's what we're doing with the FBI on the intelligence analysts that they're sending in. And that works fairly well. About 5% of our workforce is out at any one time doing that. And it doesn't necessarily lessen their commute, it may make it worse, but the concept there is that you get to better understand an organization, right? So if you go from NSA to FBI, you get to live in the FBI culture and get to better understand how the agents think and why they think, right? So that helps create a better intelligence product. But it does, you know, that kind of classified work does create a drain because our computer systems don't connect. So we are developing a common classified network, so all the agencies would be on it. You'd be able to sign on from any building. So if you're at a meeting someplace, you could sign on and check your email and share your data. That's going to be absolutely essential. And once we get that, we can do things like quit PCSing people in, allow them to have access to databases and information and share applications. And it's really the only way that we're going to be able to do it. We'll never work from home, and that's okay, at least not this generation. So, but our employees don't expect that, right? They kind of know that. But we do need to work on the technology. And the other thing I would add to, you had law, regulation, and policy. We really need to change the culture, right? I would disagree. I think we are sitting there with a supervisor with a cup of coffee looking at you.
No, you are. That's absolutely true.
And we need to change that, right? We need to give tools to allow supervisors to not do that and to understand how they need to manage to objectives a little bit and manage to those products. And because the real complaint is, even in Washington, D.C., you drive 35 miles to work to sit at a computer in a classified facility to sit at a computer and do everything all day long in a computer. You ought to be able to drive a little less to be able to do that. So that's what we're looking for. But we call the technology is called it's the Intelligence Community Information Technology Enterprise. It'll be cloud-based. It is implementing as we speak, so within a year we expect the big agencies anyway, you could be able to log on from anywhere and access your data. And then the joint duty program is how we manage our relocations. And we're starting to expand that to a PCS, to be able to do joint duty from one organization to another. We don't change employing agencies, right? So if you're a CIA analyst and you work at NSA, you're still paid by CIA, right? But you're going to spend 3 years at NSA and then you're going to go back. So.
And to build on that, yeah, because that's a great example. I'm actually familiar with some of the cloud capabilities that Odie and I are rolling out. One of the things we started to explore along with those capabilities is we actually have SCIFs, frankly, all over the world. And yet we still are in the practice of pulling analysts, intel analysts into Washington, D.C. to support a mission that might be housed here in Washington, D.C. One of the things we're starting to explore now is this idea of, hey, if you have that expertise, but you happen to be positioned at Mount Weather or Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, or wherever you are right now, and you're SCIF capable, and we have that capability, like you were mentioning earlier, we're just going to change the sign. For while you're there, you're now supporting this operational component, and you're coming to work, you're operating out of your SCIF location, but you're now performing a service for a completely different mission set, completely different operation. And again, it's the same principle, right? Why do we need to relocate you if essentially what you're doing, your capability, is housed in that virtual sphere, which happens to be a classified network, right? So again, that's the same concept of mobility gives you that spectrum of potential, even in an environment where you're dealing with classified data or sensitive data. You can still create opportunities. It may not be home site opportunities, certainly not good for everyone. In fact, I'm not an advocate for a lot of types of roles. But you have to take that lens and put it on what you're doing to begin to ask those questions. What is the role? What is the job? What are you doing? What are the characteristics of how you're doing your job? Now, how can we service those capabilities without necessarily having to move you, relocate you, build a building for you, or any of those? What are the other possibilities that we have available?
Either of you want to add to that?
Well, similar for Odie and I, we have the same challenges on teleworking because the classified information is really not part of the FBI culture. To take work home and to work on things from home because of the classification, the computer access. Thumb drives are absolutely verboten, like there's none of that. So essentially the one thing that they are developing is some computers that are secure that you can check out and take home if you need to on an ad hoc basis to work on. But I don't really see us ever being working from home in the traditional teleworking. I think we have to do other options similar to what you're talking about, working at different locations on secure networks. I know that on some of our support functions, like we have IT specialists that are basically supporting headquarters missions and managing our IT networks, but they're assigned in different field offices. So, part of the agent culture is you have to be with your squad in the office, and then going back out to do your investigation. So you're always going to be coming into a home base somewhere. And then the support staff are similar as well, with some exceptions here and there. But we're really restricted by the classification issues. People definitely don't want to take anything on the buildings. They will lose their job. So, things like that.
Yeah, when I worked for a justice component, I had a secure laptop and all these devices, and it's like, what's under your jacket? Well, I'm not setting that down anywhere. You really have to be cognizant of it.
Oh, yeah. You take something like that and you lose it somewhere, in transit, and you're in
I'm not gonna bowl you guys over, but that problem, that secure hardware problem, is a 5-year-old problem that goes away when you start to look at cloud-based Intel capabilities. Because once you go to VDI, virtual desktop interface,
you have a dumb terminal. Your phone, you can throw your phone into the nearest, enemy intel operative, and guess what? They just have a nice phone now. There's no connectivity back to your capability. So some of that is evolving with technology as well. I don't think there's ever a stage where you want somebody accessing classified information in an uncontrolled environment, which is the home site or coffee shop. But some of that concern about, hey, I carried my phone out of the building goes away when you start to talk to them about cloud-based capabilities.
Yeah, and I think these laptops that I was mentioning, so.
Yeah, you have black box laptops, yeah.
Yeah, that they'll disable.
Yeah. Encrypted hardware is another segment, thank you.
But they're not widely accessible to the whole entire workforce.
Well, we have a little time for questions, but I want to make sure you have a chance. You said virtual telework isn't something you guys really incorporated?
Yeah, it's a tough thing for the OCC. Our workforce is already really very mobile. So our examiners are out in the banks pretty much all the time. They're only back in their home office, maybe 1, 2, 3 days a week or a month rather. And in a day and age, the environment is very rapidly changing. Everybody essentially has a bank teller in their pocket now, where you can do most of your stuff. So the banking industry is very rapidly changing, and the OCC is moving pretty rapidly to adapt to some of those changes in how we regulate and things. And the banking workforce is also becoming more widespread as they adopt telework and remote work. So we're trying to adapt to some of those things and trying to adapt our workforce as well. So it's rapidly changing.
Well, I think there will be some questions in the room, not sure. We'll take one on the phone after we ask in the room. So does anyone have anything?
I have a question. This is David Bush from AT&T, and I have a question regarding the remote work capability that you discussed. And so as all these technologies mature more and more to the point where all the data that an employee may need is either in the cloud or on their device. So in effect, they might not have any files either at their desk at all when they're in a location. You have federal buildings all over the country. What challenges would there be for federal employees to work at any federal office? Let's say they could, there's an office in New York that's close to where they live. They could just go into that office with their computer, log in, and start working. As long as it's a GSA facility and it has appropriate security. So they would log in, they could get, let's say, for example, a software-defined network would be spun up right on the fly from that office. They're not necessarily connecting over the internet, although they could be, but it's a secure connection. Mm-hmm. So that technology that enables their work is actually part of the building instead of something that's put in afterwards when a tenant moves into a GSA facility, right? So so this could dramatically reduce the amount of time that's that's required when agencies move staffing from one building to another or open field offices, spin them down. You could just have offices and people could move to wherever they need to.
So
what are the challenges?
So the real challenge is, and let me say this first because the people sitting around me are the kind of people that have to tell you once they tell you what they do. The real challenge is you have to sort of see this through a few different lenses, and those lenses really depend on the kind of information you're processing in a given location or through a given virtual capability, right? So for the public trust employee of the average federal agency, the model that you're talking about becomes that's sort of the UK model, which is, for those of you not familiar, the United Kingdom builds these small sort of live-work environments all over the United Kingdom, and their employees kind of commute to that, log in. They might work for someone in London, but they live in Leeds or something like that. That's very much that model. For the average public trust employee who might be dealing with PII or sort of confidential information, but something that you could have in an access-controlled environment that doesn't require compartmentalization, I think that's a very viable model. And I think over time, as federal agencies continue to employ these kinds of technologies, you'll see an evolution begin to emerge. We're, within CBP, already exploring that for our non-classified staff. Opportunities to create interoperable office environments that are essentially, hey, if you happen to be part of Homeland Security and you want to come in and access our network and great, come on in, and you're not doing something that, you know, that shouldn't be in that environment. For the classified or the compartmentalized environment, that's a different equation, right? I have been talking to some folks from the Department of Defense. They're looking at rolling out a virtual desktop interface within the Joint Chiefs, and some of the conversation there is even within the Pentagon, you still have hardwired, hardline, you know, terminals in SCIF spaces that are only accessible from that SCIF space, even though they're inside the Pentagon. The question then becomes, well, can you create cloud-based capabilities that might be intra-DoD or intra-governmental that are SCIF, but are SCIF that are positioned throughout various locations? Yes, but when it becomes compartmentalized information, even being in a SCIF is not enough because the person sitting next to you is not in your compartment, right? So it gets a lot more tricky in that environment, but I think for the sort of the average public trust employee, that's a much more open discussion.
And I think we'll get to that solution someday with identity authentication techniques, and you know, whether you can see data that the person next to you can't see, and that's always a challenge. But I think there's a cultural issue as well, and a mechanical one in the sense that the supervisor needs to know where you are, and he needs to be able to access it. So we have to build capability that allows the supervisor to know that you're there. I always hear the concern, well, how are you going to manage it? How are you going to know that 500 people aren't going to show up to work on 10 terminals? Right? And my argument is, well, you don't manage the rush hour every day. People adjust when they can leave their house depending upon their experience. You don't try to manage it, so I think it would work itself. But you kind of need hoteling, reservation software, all that kind of stuff to help it. But, you know, but you get into the problems where an agency says, wait a second, why are you occupying a space in my agency? Because you're from another agency. And then you get in who's going to pay for the electricity and all that kind of stuff. That's the policies that we've got to figure out to be able to do that.
I have a half-joking question. What color is the cloud-based screen going to be? Is red, green, and yellow are
For us, it's red at night, so it doesn't, you know, you don't stay, you know, because you sleep better when you go home. Blue in the day.
I'm just joking. I have a two-part question. One is, how do you guys play and freeze the footprint? Part of what you guys are talking about is, you know, how to reduce space. Having worked, supported the FBI, I know that was a big concern for them. You know, leverage, I use telework, if that's okay. Leverage telework to be able to do that. And then the second piece of that is,
Can you repeat the question? We can't hear the question.
Once he's finished, we'll repeat it.
And then the second piece to that is, how do you manage performance for those staff that are not, you know, that you're not able to look over the shoulder? I'm just curious, having worked at OPM, having been part of I'll just say a performance-like pilot, as a manager at OPM, it was very challenging to get there, but if you trust your folks and you've been there, I think it's a little bit easier. So I'm just curious how you guys are managing both the freeze and footprint as well as the performance management side of things.
Looking at the question, I'll leave out the part about the screen.
That's fine.
But you know, trying to understand how you're managing the employees and the performance aspect of it is one component.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, footprint's a big issue for us right now, because right now our bargaining unit agreement says that every examiner has to have an office space. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense when, you know, these folks are only in it a few days out of the month, you know, to pay for a whole office space for them. On the other hand, you know, that's kind of an engagement thing, you know, because if you have an office, you're sort of tied to it. There's some pride there in having a permanent space, you know. So it's definitely costs and benefits to that. You know, we're actively exploring kind of shared space, shared resources for that. And then just to touch on your other question, you know, to me as a manager, you manage the results. And I think that's what you're referring to with ROW, is with the OPM project. You know, to me as a manager, you want to try to manage the results, not necessarily where the person is when they're doing the results. So that's always important to me. You know, my philosophy has always been, you know, if you could come to work, you could easily goof off while you're at work and not get anything done as you could at home or at the coffee shop or in a skiff somewhere, it doesn't really matter where you are, you can always be home. So it's managing that work product, managing the deliverables, managing outcomes rather than, are you in the coffee shop today or are you in your office today?
I just want to repeat this. It's a two-part question. So one was, how do we play and freeze the footprint? And two was, to what extent have we mastered the fine art of results-oriented management practices? The first part of that is, we play heavily in freeze the footprint. Part of the purpose for my organization is to explore ways that we can use these other capabilities for workforce mobility as a tool to help alleviate burden or pressure on our real estate footprint. Let me say, knowing that we're in the GSA Public Building Service building, that if you start that discussion from the perspective of shrinking your footprint, you're probably going to fail because of the cultural challenges with the necessary evolution that has to happen in the workforce to make mobility possible, which leads us into this question about performance management, results-oriented management practices. So if I asked everyone in the room, how many of you guys are supervisors? A few of you. How many of you guys consider yourself performance-based supervisors? I mean, managed by performance, right? How many of you guys like having your employees in front of you? Okay, so that's not a performance-based, right? So 90, I happen to be, so I'm 40 years old, so I sort of span this divide that's occurring in the workforce right now. I came up in the workforce at a time when proximity-based management practices were the norm, right? Which is, if I see you, you're in front of me, you're at work, I just did air quotes for those of you on the phone, you're at work, therefore you're being productive, right? And now there's this evolution towards this concept of results-oriented management practices, which says, I may not see you, you may not be sitting in front of me, but you're delivering a product, a service, a thing, therefore you're accomplishing work, right? Now, the challenge behind that, and we all use that terminology, and I'll raise my hand and say, I'm a performance-based manager, and my folks back there will laugh, right? Because I will also tell them, hey, you know what, I really need to see you this week. The challenge within that paradigm is you have to confront the qualities about proximity that are important to a workforce and ensure that you're providing for those characteristics, those qualities. So for example, if you want your team to identify with each other, the best way for them to do that is to see each other, to be together, which means sending them home permanently or sending them to another city permanently is not going to be a successful way to build identity within your team. As a manager, you have to deliberately now plan for the things that you used to do intuitively, right? Because you used to just say, my folks sit in the same office, therefore they identify with each other. That's great. I don't even have to do anything. They just show up. Now as managers, we have to prepare them for that deliberate step of bringing their folks together at the right time to create group identity, a team, right? But not relying on the office to be the tool to do that anymore, right? It's the same thing with how we assign work. So my folks give me a lot of grief because sometimes I'll send them an email or I'll see one of them and I'll just say, hey, I'm going to need that thing for that meeting we have on Monday. And they'll go, what is that? Right? That's nothing. I've given them nothing. So when we talk about work, when we define work, when we explain our expectations, as managers, we have to now do that in a much more thoughtful and careful way so that our employees can deliver something to us that satisfies the underlying requirement, right? And when we begin to do that, suddenly work is no longer 1800 F Street. Work is now what I deliver. Now, if you're at all paying attention to what I just said, that means who's going to have the hardest time making this transition? The employee? That's right. Those of you that raised your hand and said, my folks need to be sitting in front of me, right? Because now I'm asking you to change a mental schema for how you work with your employees. It's no longer, oh, you're sitting in front of me so I can just spitball until we've agreed on what you're doing. Or you're sitting in front of me so yeah, I know you're doing something. That's great news. 2, what am I asking you to do? When am I asking you to deliver it by? How do I want it accomplished? What's the purpose? Do you understand the purpose? do we need to get together and have a face-to-face, or can you handle this and just check back with me when you need it? That's a lot of mental athletics that, frankly, we've never asked folks to do before. And just asking them to do it because we've handed out the mobile device, right, is going to result in a lot of managers going, this is a failure. My folks aren't delivering. They're unproductive. Oh, quick segue. How many of you guys say, my folks are productive? If you're not raising your hand, I'm worried about your staff now, right? How many of you know what your folks produce, right? Because if you're not actively defining what productive means in your workforce, then there's no conversation for you to even have about productivity. One of the most common things we encounter when we work with an organization, either within CBP or sometimes when we work with other client agencies, is someone will say, well, how do you know productivity didn't go down? And I'll say, well, how do I know that they're productive today? And they'll say, well, because they're there. That's not productivity. So the shift in paradigm extends well beyond real estate, well beyond simple policy questions. It is literally a cultural dialogue that has to happen now about what are we asking people to deliver and how are we asking them to deliver it. Once you get to that perspective, then you can have a meaningful dialogue about where they have to be to deliver it. Right?
Just add on to that real quick.
Yeah, we're just heading a little past the 11:30 mark, but I want to make sure you guys have a chance if you want to wrap up. I think we'll have to close out the questions, but if you guys want to just wrap up, that'd be great.
Oh, no, I was just going to add to that. You know, we're living in a society right now where we have 4 or 5 generations at work. You know, so you'll have the typical, 9 to 5, don't bother me after 5 because I'm out of here, get in on time, leave exactly at 5, and all the way to millennials now are very apt at sort of this in and out of work type thing. So they may come in at 10, they may, 2 hours of work, but then they want to take a walk for 2 hours, or they want to do something, they want to go shopping. But then, they'll start work again at 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and then get in 4 or 5 hours of work at night, so it's very fluid now. And I think it's very challenging as a manager to try to connect all those dots, because you have the people that 9 to 5, don't talk to me after that, but then you have the people that are sort of very fluid about when they work, how they work, and who they work with. So I think it's very challenging as a manager. It's very exciting to be a manager right now, I think. The pace of change, I think, has really picked up. Things like telework, alternative locations, really seeming to take hold right now. We've gone from this sort of discussion about, well, I sort of view telework as a benefit. I think people are viewing it now more as a work imperative. And some of these other arrangements are work imperative to get the mission critical talent that you couldn't otherwise get in the locations and where you need them. So I think it's just a really, really cool time. And thanks for having me. Thanks for your questions.
Anything else? We're a little past the mark, but that's
Sure, Stan Scott. I'll just close out by saying, I'm a firm believer that people come to work every day because they want to do a good job, they want to serve the nation. And we as managers and supervisors, we need to take the risk and advance the culture a little bit. And I think this generation in particular is worth that risk. They will perform.
I talk a lot, so here we go.
And this is just Julie from the FBI. So just on the concept of the workforce, the culture of the FBI is we have the multi-generational issue, but we also have the agent investigative issue versus the professional staff culture, and then the merging of the analysts with the agents as well too. So we manage all those different things. But when I first came in the FBI, the culture was that the agents, if you were in the office, you weren't doing your job. You were thought to be out of the office. You should be out investigating, be in the field, and then it sort of has evolved over time because we have a lot more duties that are inside the office now. And then for professional staff, it's always been the view, is like you said, is like if they're doing their job, they're in front of you. But we're seeing a shift too in the sense that it's now we're more metrics driven, more deliverables driven, more performance driven. So I think as we're evolving over time, managers are being a lot more flexible, and we have, although we can't do telework, we do alternate work schedules and things like that. And these units. And sometimes, you know, with my workforce, if they can come in later and leave later, and you know, whatever works. Particularly when you're living in a city like DC or you know New York or any of the other cities where your commute times are very challenging for employees, and so I think each manager, each office tries to deal with those things as it depends on their units and their employees.
Can I just finish? I do actually want to finish one because you make a great point. We actually finished a demonstration project. Just to answer your real estate question, we started the project from the perspective we want to employ more alternate work location, telework, other kinds of capabilities, fully mobilized workforce. The location is totally depersonalized. It uses a concierge system to manage seating and all of that stuff. We had goals for real estate, but we actually didn't tell the goals to the workforce. Our goal was 40% reduction in square footage for the workforce that we targeted. It's about 500 employees. We actually ended up with 46%, and we let them be part of the design process. So if you do this right, your real estate, you'll accomplish your real estate goals almost de facto if you do it the right way, because like you were saying earlier, the workforce is evolving a lot, and the expectation for the office environment is such now that if we're designing it to meet their expectations, it's a much more efficient, much more flexible environment for them.
Great. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Outstanding.
Very good.